Unit 3 deals with liberties, rights, and policy that affects those liberties and rights, and so we really just sort of refer to it as civil liberties and civil rights. And guys, it may sound very simple because it's only a couple of things, but these are very, very dense subjects, very intense topics, because they deal with your liberties and your rights and how they have been interpreted over time. And so it will take us a little while to delve into this information because it is so rich in information and so dense in information as well. So we'll dive right in. So the first thing is we have to understand what are civil liberties and civil rights. And sometimes these terms are used interchangeably to mean the same thing, but there is a difference. And I think that the best I'll give you the definition of each, but then I'll give you what I feel like is the best way to remember and understand the difference between a civil liberty and a civil right. But a civil liberty is individual rights and personal freedoms in which the government may not interfere. And civil rights are protections of citizens, of citizen equality provided by the government. And so the best way that I know how to really simplify this for you is that essentially civil liberties are protections from the government, and civil rights are protections by the government. So your civil liberties are things that the government cannot infringe upon, and your civil rights are things that the government essentially gives you to ensure your protection and your equality. So we're going to look at these, and we're going to look at civil liberties to begin with. So the idea of civil liberties have their origins in the ratification debate. And we've already discussed the ratification debate that broke out between the supporters, which were known as the Federalists, and the opponents, which were the Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists did not like the Constitution because they felt it did not explicitly protect citizens from the government. Federalists, on the other hand, believed it did protect citizens from the government and that the entire purpose of the Constitution was to protect the citizens. And so there was no real necessary need for a, quote, Bill of Rights because the entire document was essentially a Bill of Rights. But to compromise and to make it a little bit more palatable to the Anti-Federalists, the Federalists will agree to add a Bill of Rights. Okay? And so if we look at the Bill of Rights, the book says that it could be called a Bill of Liberties because it created a private sphere of personal liberty that is free from government intervention. And so even though they're called rights, they really are civil liberties. They are your civil liberties because they're things in which the government cannot infringe upon. These are protections of citizens from government action. Now, applying these civil liberties has been different over time. And so we have to look, because we live in a federalist system where we have the different layers of government, the state government, the federal government, we have to figure out how these are applied. And so we look at the application to the states. Okay? Are civil liberties, are this Bill of Rights, is this Bill of Rights applicable to the states? To begin with, the Bill of Rights was seen as applicable only to the national government and not the states. So the states had their own, ways of doing things, and this was only applicable to you at the federal level. And states were not really incorporated into that until a little bit later. But we will have a civil war that will happen that sort of grapples with this idea of who is supreme, federal or state government. And with the passage of the 14th Amendment, we had the prohibition of states from making or enforcing any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. It goes on to say, nor shall any state deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Right? And so it's essentially seen as a big deal because the 13th Amendment had been passed in 1865 that outlawed slavery. And so what the passage of these 13th and 14th Amendments does is it appears that it's going to create an inclusive society where everyone is protected equally according to the law, and that the states could not deprive individuals of life, liberty, property, and must, if they chose to do that, deprive a person of life, liberty, and property, they had to do so according to the law, with due process of law. And so the 14th Amendment's a big amendment because of that equal protection of the Equal Protection Clause, the equal protection of every citizen um, according to the law. So, as I said, it appears to create an inclusive society, but this is really not how the Supreme Court will interpret the 14th Amendment for about another 100 years. And so what occurs between the end of the Civil War in the 1960s, when we really see the movement for civil rights, we see the Supreme Court utilize a doctrine known as selective incorporation, meaning that it was a process by which different protections in the Bill of Rights were gradually incorporated and applied to states using the 14th Amendment. And we see this all the way up into 2010. So they didn't take this Bill of Rights and automatically apply them to the states equally. It's going to take a number of years to do so. And it's going to be this big turning point with the Civil War that really moves people, or moves the Supreme Court or the government to pass this Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment to try and protect everybody according to law and give everyone the equal rights that they deserve. But if you know anything about American history, you know that there was not equality, and there is still not equality according to race after the Civil War. Even though that war was fought and the slaves were freed and they became citizens, and we had this Equal Protection Clause passed in the 14th Amendment, they never really got the equality that the 14th Amendment essentially says that they have. And so the Supreme Court is going to take baby steps in incorporating these Bill of Rights to the states. And they're going to, do one piece at a time. And it's going to take a very strenuous and arduous and long process to try to apply these rights, these liberties within the Bill of Rights to everyone in the nation. And we still see it going on even all the way up until 2010. And the way that the Supreme Court does this is through their power of judicial review and their power of interpreting the Constitution. And so it will come to fruition through a series of different Supreme Court cases that we'll talk about as we move forward. And so if we look at the application, I said that this occurs all the way up even through to modern times in 2010, and I would dare say up into even 2019. The application of the Bill of Rights to modern society is still a work in process. We oftentimes think that the Bill of Rights is an all-inclusive protection, but it isn't. Some provisions are settled areas of law. So when we look at the Bill of Rights, some of those things are settled. They were settled by Supreme Court cases a long time ago, and that's how they are applied in society. But others aren't yet. And so we're still grappling with some of these civil liberties, these civil rights that people are supposed to be afforded, and how that should look within society and how that should be applied in modern day society. So let's begin by looking at the civil liberties that we have. And what we're going to do, we're not going to go through every single amendment because that would take forever, but we are going to look at some very important ones there in the Bill of Rights, that first 10 amendments. We're not going to look at all 10, but and understand that there are 27 changes or amendments to the Constitution. We're going to look mostly at some important ones in the first 10 in that Bill of Rights, and then also that 14th Amendment, which is that Equal Protection Clause. So we're going to start by looking at our First Amendment. Now, what you have to understand as we start looking at the amendments is that nothing is absolute, right? You do not have unregulated and unfettered freedoms to do as you please. Even though these things are protected, everything has a limit. There are no absolutes. And so if we look at this First Amendment, if you know anything about the Constitution, we know that the First Amendment is the freedom of speech, religion, press, petition, and assembly. And so we are going to begin by looking at the religion aspect of this First Amendment. There are two clauses to the religion aspect of the First Amendment. There's clause number 1, which is known as the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause says, Congress shall make no law respecting an established religion. So what they're saying is that in the Establishment Clause, Congress cannot create a religion that everyone must follow, because they've just broken apart from Great Britain, who had a state religion, Anglicanism, the Church of England, and there were people who fled for religious freedoms, for religious persecution reasons. And so they want to ensure that the new government does not create a religion that everyone must follow. So that's the first clause. The second clause says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so we need to look at the interpretations of this, because there are different interpretations. The authors of the First Amendment felt like government should be prohibited from establishing an official church or religion. And as I said, they had just separated from England. They had just separated from the Anglican Church, and they under the Anglican Church, they were not always free to practice as they saw fit. They didn't want that for their new country. Okay, so that's the first interpretation. The second interpretation says that the government should not take sides among competing religions, but may provide assistance to religious institutions or ideas as long as it does not show favoritism. So it's the second interpretation. The first interpretation is a very basic one. The second interpretation is that, there are going to be different religions. The government cannot show favoritism or take sides, but they can provide assistance to a religious entity if needed, as long as they're not doing it because they like it better than others. And then there's a third interpretation, which is the one that's most commonly held in modern day. And it refers to the wall of separation between church and state that was championed by Thomas Jefferson. He said that there should be a separation of church and state, that, they shouldn't really bleed into one another very much. If you have a government that is run by religious principles, you have an overlap of politics and religion, then you become a theocracy. And a theocracy is a type of government that is practiced even in modern day in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Great Britain, because their religious laws do overlap into their political laws. And it's to varying degrees. It's sort of on a spectrum, because if you're in certain places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's going to be to a greater degree than it is in Great Britain. But they wanted to be free from this idea of theocracy. And so there's going to be a lot of grappling with this religious clause, this religious aspect of the First Amendment. Now, as I said, nothing is absolute. And there have been some very restrictive types of interpretations by the Supreme Court over time. There have been some very permissive interpretations over time. Understand that the application of this religious aspect of the First Amendment has not been consistent over time, right? Because if we look at it, it's very restrictive in regards to schools, because school sponsorship of moments of silence or non-denominational prayer is highly suggestive of school sponsorship of a religion in violation of the Establishment Clause. So they're saying schools which are funded by the government, if they champion these ideas of school prayer or a moment of silence or something of that nature, it is suggestive that that government entity is in violation of that Establishment Clause. But it has been very permissive in other areas, like public displays of religious symbols by a city. And so if we look to a couple of Supreme Court cases, both of which were decided in 2005, we see sort of the inconsistencies that sort of play out. The first case in 2005 is called Van Orden versus Perry, and it was decided by a 5-4 decision. In Texas, they said that the display of the Ten Commandments at the state capitol building was not a violation of the First Amendment. But then they go in another case in the same year and say in McCreary versus the ACLU of Kentucky in a 5-4 decision that the Kentucky display of the Ten Commandments was in violation of the Constitution. So it seems like it might be a little inconsistent. So what was the purpose? That is the question that we have to ask. What was the purpose of the religious display in each case? In the Van Orden case, that first case, it was a secular purpose. It was tied to the development of law over time. It was displayed in conjunction with other pieces of codified law throughout world history that have affected American law and influenced American laws in modern day. In the McCreary case, it was a purely religious purpose. And it had been constructed recently, and it had been constructed by itself. However, what this does is it shows us that the application of the religious, this establishment clause in the First Amendment dealing with religion is not settled, right? It's extremely up in the air. People are still fighting about it, and there are still varying interpretations. And so we look at the free exercise clause, that area of prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And we have a couple of Supreme Court cases that really side with the individuals in regards to the practicing of their religion. And so the first case is in the West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett. And what this case said was that Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to salute the American flag because it violated their religion were, in fact, free to do so. The Supreme Court decided that even if it were offensive to others, these actions were protected under the Free Exercise Clause. Because not saluting the flag or any other item violated their religion, they didn't do it. And so they were freely exercising their religion. The government in this Free Exercise Clause cannot prohibit this. And so the Supreme Court will side with the Jehovah's Witness family out of West Virginia, and it sort of paves the way for the ability for Jehovah's Witnesses and other religions as well to abstain from saluting the American flag. Another case was Holt versus Hobbs, and this dealt with a Muslim prisoner in jail in Alabama. Because of the dress code, this prisoner was not allowed to grow a beard, and beards were a part of his religious practices. And so he argued that the inability to be allowed to grow a beard violated his Free Exercise Clause. And the Supreme Court sided with him because part of his religion was growing a beard. He was being prevented from doing that. The Supreme Court said, we can't do that. We cannot step in and say that they cannot practice their religion as they see fit. So there's a lot of varying aspects to the religion aspect of the First Amendment, and understand that it is not settled. It's not, we kind of think that it is, but it really isn't. So let's turn our attention to speech. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes referred to the freedom of speech as the marketplace, quote, marketplace of ideas. And the definition of freedom of speech, or not the definition, but the part of the First Amendment that deals with the freedom of speech is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Because, the press, by extension, is exercising freedom of speech when they write about certain things. And so the speech protections are held to a very high standard. If the government wants to regulate the speech protections, if they want to interfere with the protections of freedom of speech, they must have incontrovertible reasons for doing so. Now, that being said, there are varying degrees of protection based upon the type of speech. There are multiple different types of speech. I don't know if you knew that or not, but there are. And the first type of speech is what is known as political speech. Political speech is consistently protected. It's one of those areas that has a high level of protection, and it's very consistently protected. It's of the greatest concern. It was of the greatest concern to the framers of the Constitution. This is really what they had in mind when they talked about the freedom of speech, the ability of individuals to question and maybe speak against their government. And so the first modern free speech case that we see occurred during World War I with the Espionage Act of 1917. The Espionage Act said that the government could regulate or censor information if it constituted a clear and present danger to national security. The Supreme Court upheld the act as long as individuals constituted a clear and present danger. But since the 1920s, it has been consistently protected, even if we see that it is outrageous. If it's an outrageous type of speech, or it may be offensive to us. And so that leads us into our next category of speech, which is symbolic speech, speech plus, assembly, and petition. So, governing speech-related activities. Speech-related activities, symbolic speech is government-related activities. Leafletting, demonstrations, generally anything that is designed to send a political message. And one of the big cases to come out of this is Texas versus Johnson in 1989, which we know as the flag burning case. Texas had a law on the state books that said that you could not destroy something that was a sort of a highly respected symbol within society. Well, there was a demonstration outside of the Republican National Convention that was being held in Texas where an individual burned a flag in protest. The Texas law banned the burning of flags, and so this individual was arrested. He sued, because he felt like it was an infringement upon his freedom of speech, and the Supreme Court is going to side with the individual and say that this Texas law banning the burning of flags is unconstitutional because the burning of a flag was expressive and it was protected by the First Amendment. So even though we might see it, some individuals might see it as offensive or something of that nature, it's still protected. And so even if something is something that you absolutely abhor and you cannot believe that it would be protected, it is protected because we cannot pick and choose which parts of speech we really want to protect. And so that really leads me into this case called Snyder versus Phelps in 2011. There is a church out of Westboro, Kansas, I believe, called Westboro Baptist Church, and they have a they picket the funerals of soldiers, and they say that dead soldiers are the price that America has to pay for accepting certain behaviors that are against God. Things like abortion, things like gay rights and gay marriage. And so they picket soldiers' funerals, and a soldier's father sued them and said that he had been hurt in the process. But the Supreme Court declared that picketing was constitutional because even though it is detestable, in this case, it is a protected form of free speech. So they're saying yes, what they're protesting is awful and detestable, and I can't believe that they would actually do that. But if we ban them from picketing, then we have to ban everybody else from picketing. And so it infringes upon symbolic speech and assembly and things of that nature. And so even though we see it as ugly, we have to protect it. That's the job of the Supreme Court. Speech plus is speech accompanied by a physical activity. This could be something like sitting in, demonstrating. It is protected, but it is conditional. And the condition is in regards to public order. If you are causing disorder within the public, then you're not necessarily going to be protected under that First Amendment. And then we have to look at speech by a public school student, because this is one that's pretty big within society. Public school students have limited free speech. Student speech can sometimes interfere with the school's goal of teaching students limits of socially acceptable behavior. And so schools can censor student speech that advocates or celebrates the use of illegal drugs or underage drinking or something of that nature. And so if a student advocates some of those things, then the administration has the ability to step in and regulate that. And even though it is a regulation of freedom of speech, it is done on an individual who is in a setting that is trying to teach socially acceptable behavior. And so the Supreme Court has sided with school districts in this regard quite a bit. So understand that the freedoms that you have are protected by varying degrees. It's not going to be all or nothing. It's sort of a spectrum of things. And so we turn our attention to press. Press is protected against prior restraint or the government actions to suppress material deemed harmful in some way, or censorship. And so the precedent for press is freedom of press is going to be set in a Supreme Court case known as Neer versus Minnesota in 1931. And it stated that the government could not prevent newspapers or magazines from publishing whatever they wanted. So newspapers and magazines, you can publish whatever you want. Now, you could be subjected to libel and slander and cases like that, but the government can't step in and stop you from doing that. If that's the course you want to take, you have the ability to do that. It's going to be reasserted 40 years later in 1971 in the New York Times versus the United States, when the New York Times was going to publish the Pentagon Papers, which they had gotten legally from a source who had gotten them from another source illegally. But the Supreme Court's going to say that the government cannot prevent the publication of letters, even though the person who gave them to the New York Times may have received them illegally. Okay? So the press is going to be pretty heavily protected. Now, one thing that you have to understand is that sources are not protected. You cannot tell a source, if you are a journalist, you cannot tell a source that you will not give them up, because you can be held in contempt of court and you might do jail time if you refuse to give up your sources. So journalists can be jailed for failing to give information in court regarding their sources. So understand that you do not have full protection in that regard. Now, there are areas of limited protection. We don't protect everything 100%. First of all, libel and slander. And this is what I was talking about when I was talking about the press. This is the reckless disregard for the truth, damaging to the victim because it is malicious, scandalous, and defamatory. Libel is published work and slander is oral statements. So you can't just stand up or write something and publish it that is unequivocally false and expect to be able to get away with it, especially if you're doing it in a way that's malicious or defamatory, or you're trying to hurt somebody, because it won't be protected. Another area of limited protection is obscenity and pornography. And these things are defined as speech or writing that appeals to the prurient interests or incites lust. But understand that obscenity and pornography are very subjective. So how do we limit those things? How do we regulate those things? Because what might be obscene and pornographic to one person might not be obscene and pornographic to another. And even the Supreme Court has a hard time really giving a strict definition of what pornography is. And Justice Potter Stewart, when dealing with a case dealing with pornography, says, I don't know how to define it, but, quote, I'll know it when I see it. And so there have been some attempts to define pornography as deemed prurient by the average person according to community standards, something that depicts sexual conduct in patently offensive ways, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. But they largely have left this up to local governments rather than creating a national standard. But a series of court cases has protected the ability of individuals to engage in viewing pornography throughout the time period 1997 through 2011. So it is protected on some level, but understand that it is limited protection. And then there's another area that is limited protection, and that is called fighting words. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but fighting words is the movement of expressive words from symbolic to actual conduct. So you're essentially trying to direct an incitement of damaging conduct. You're trying to provoke somebody into fighting you based upon whatever it is you were saying. And this stems back to 1942 with the arrest of a man who called a police officer a goddamn racketeer and a damn fascist. He was arrested, and his arrest was upheld because the language had no essential part of any exposition of ideas. And so essentially, he was trying to provoke that police officer. It went from speech to trying to incite something more, and so it was upheld. And in a 1952, the Supreme Court case Dennis versus the United States said that there is no public interest in permitting insulting or fighting words that tend to incite a break of peace. Now, there is a large movement away from this, reversing every conviction and utilizing fighting words as their argument for conviction. In 2019, so recently, an appellate court in, I believe, Michigan, actually ruled that it was not against the law to flip off a police officer because a woman had been pulled over for speeding. She got pulled over. She didn't get a ticket for speeding. The cop gave her a warning. But as they were driving off, she flipped him off. So he pulled her over again and gave her a ticket for speeding, even though he'd already let her off. And so she challenged it, and it went all the way to the appellate court there in Michigan. I think it's Michigan. It's either Michigan or Minnesota. I can't remember. And the appellate court said that he had they didn't have the ability to pull her over the second time. To give her that speeding ticket the second time because he'd already pulled her over, already let her off the hook, and that the flipping off of a police officer was not a reason to be able to pull her over. And so there, is sort of some gray areas in regards to this, and so obviously something that is still kind of in the works. Okay, I'm going to stop here. We'll continue with civil liberties in the next lecture.